All right. It is gone.
If it is stored in the cloud. Okay. So it is recording right now, right?
Yep, it's going.
Good. Okay, let me introduce you and then I will pass it off to you.
Okay.
Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. Hope you guys had a good long weekend here in Vancouver. Our speaker tonight is James Serra. James works for Microsoft as a big data and data analytics, data warehousing solution architect. He has over 35 years of IT experience and has been previously been a SQL Server MVP. We're lucky to have James introduce us to Microsoft Fabric today. So James, the floor is yours. You can take over.
Awesome. Thanks. Let me share my screen. I'm not used to Zoom. I'm in Teams all day, so I just got to remember where some of these. There we go. There's the button. This should work, hopefully. Let's see. All right, let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
All right, awesome. So welcome everyone. My name is James Serra. As mentioned, I'm a data and AI solution architect at Microsoft. I've been at Microsoft for about 9 years, and I have a long background in IT. I've had a lot of different jobs over the years. It's been 35 years, nearly coming up on 40 years that I've been doing this in all sorts of roles. And in my history, I've been everything from a developer to a DBA to an architect, and built a lot of solutions. And for the time I've been at Microsoft, it's focused on pre-sales, technical sales, which is educating customers about architectures and various products. Of course, Microsoft Fabric, the one we're talking today, has been a topic that's quite common recently in there. So we'll get into what exactly this product is. And a quick plug for my upcoming book that is going to cover a lot of topics that are related to Fabric when it gets to using Fabric to build a data lakehouse or a data mesh or a data fabric. And I found a lot of customers are confused about all the different architectures. There's a lack of clarity on a lot of the concepts that relate to data warehousing. So I started this book almost a year ago and getting close to being finished of it. So if you have an early subscription, you could go and see the preview. It's an early release program. If you don't have an early subscription, just send me an email. I'll send you the PDF of the first 11 chapters. So hopefully that'll help educate you too on this, to clarify a lot of the topics that cause a lot of confusion nowadays. And in particular, the data fabric that, or Microsoft Fabric talking about now is a data lakehouse. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but the book goes more into details of what a data lakehouse is. So the agenda for today, and I'll allow people to ask questions along the way. You can drop it in the chat. Hopefully I can, within my Zoom, I can see the chat. I think I can. And if not, just come off mic and raise your question on there. So I'll pause at various times for people to do that. The topics that I'm going to cover today are listed on here in the agenda, and it's just a subset of all the things I could talk about with Fabric. There's so many of them that I could spend hours and hours. So I focus on these, I would say, most relevant topics when it comes to Fabric and learning about it here. So I can always do follow-ups to cover in more detail, or you can find out on your own. But this will give you a good understanding what Fabric is, because I'll also go through demos. At a high level, Microsoft Fabric is this unified solution of a number of Microsoft products. If you're familiar with Synapse, Synapse is a platform as a service that does a good job of putting all the products together. However, you still got a lot of independence with the products. Each product's got its own compute and storage, its own security. its own configuration screens. With Fabric, the idea is to make it a software as a service where all the products are not only together, but they look and feel the same, and then similar configurations and security are shared among all of the products, including the storage. And the storage within Fabric is called OneLake. It's Data Lake Storage Gen 2 underneath the covers. It's a data lake, but all the products use it instead of each having their own storage in there. So all the products are also split out into profiles. So you can look at a data engineering profile or data warehouse profile, which groups together a bunch of the products in there. And it does some customization along the way to make it easier, if that's your role, to use the product, as you'll see in the demo. There's a lot of single pieces within Fabric that are shared among everything else. A single navigation model, a single data lake, a single storage format, and on listed here. So it makes it a lot easier for anybody to go and use Fabric, whether they're a IT person who's an engineer, or they're just a citizen developer or Power BI report builder, and they want to use the product. And if they want to use more advanced capabilities, it makes it really easy for them to do so. It is a SaaS product, or you can argue maybe a SaaS-like product, but it's definitely a step above the PaaS products in there, and that it's centralized administration-wise, security-wise. It's very quick and easy to build solutions, as I'll demo, and there is minimal knobs. Of course, everything's got trade-offs. Being a DBA, I like it when I had a lot of knobs, but the idea is, can we have a product that is fast and performant and easy to use by auto-optimizing and configuring and integrating everything? And that's what Fabric does to I think, great success. So underneath the covers, it's adding indexes and it's tuning things, but that's all hidden from the end user. But the idea is it makes it really easy to build a solution without having to go and do a lot of configuration. As an example, if you use Synapse and you want to create a storage account, you'll see on the left-hand side here, there's all these different steps you got to go through and fields you got to fill out in order to get a storage account. With Fabric, if you want a new data lake, you just enter the name and that's it. Everything else is taken care of for you. Another example is in Synapse, if you wanted to create a workspace with a dedicated pool, which in Synapse model is relational storage with a dedicated pool of compute attached to that storage. A lot of things you got to go through. You got to create the Synapse workspace, and then you got to create a dedicated pool. In Fabric, you simply go and enter the name of the warehouse in there. And that's what most of the products are. No configuration other than entering the name. A few things I like to explain to customers and frequently asked questions before we go further is a couple of things to point out. Think of Fabric as you're taking the Power BI workspace and adding all these features of Synapse to it that have been made SaaS specific on there. So don't think of it as an evolution of Synapse. Think of it as taking all those Synapse features and other products and some new products and put it onto Power BI workspace. So what that means is you're just going to wake up and you're going to have your Power BI workspaces automatically migrated to Fabric workspaces. The way it is now is there's still two separate workspaces, a Power BI and a Fabric. Eventually it'll all be Fabric. And then the Power BI capacities will become Fabric capacities. Again, they're both exist right now, but they're essentially the same thing. And they'll all eventually be renamed and the Fabric capacities. And so your Power BI tenant, if you were using Power BI tenant right now, all it takes is the flip of a switch, which I'll show, in order to have all these additional Fabric functionality and workloads in your Power BI tenant on there. So that's automatically built in there. It's waiting to be used. You just have to have admin turn it on. Everything's aligned to backend Fabric capacity. And this is a really cool thing. It's just like Power BI capacity, where you have these tiers and you select what you want to use, and you get a specific compute assigned to that, to you, dedicated to your company, your tenant, and then it's a universal bucket of compute. So instead of having to do things in Synapse where you have to go and say, well, I want my Synapse dedicated pool to use a certain amount of compute, I want my Spark clusters to use a certain amount of compute, Data Factory integration, runtime, all these different products, instead of having all their own individual compute, is all goes from this universal bucket. So no matter what you're using, it's pulling from this universal bucket. So it makes it a lot easier to get started and maintain it and track costs and all that, and also optimize things because of a uniformity in the compute that's being used. Everything is serverless in Fabric. If you use Synapse, you're familiar with the serverless pools and dedicated pools. All that is gone. It's combined into one. You don't even realize you're using a pool. It's just working behind the scenes against this universal bucket of compute. There's no more relational storage to it. So this is a big change where we get to this dedicated lakehouse, or I'm sorry, a data lakehouse, which in my definition of it is that means you're not using relational storage. So everything is stored in a data lake. It uses Delta Lake, which is a software layer on top of a data lake that gives the data lake relational database-like capabilities. For example, asset transactions, versioning, where you could have what's called time travel, so it versions all the data as it comes in there, the ability to do individual updates, deletes, and inserts. None of those are possible with a data lake. So Delta Lake came along from Databricks and gives the data lake additional warehouse-like capabilities, so you don't have to use relational storage. Of course, again, there's trade-offs. Some things you'll sacrifice could be performance or certain features like referential integrity. They just don't exist with Delta Lake in there. But it goes 90% of the way of giving you everything a relational storage has, to the point where Microsoft is recommending Data Lakehouse and Fabric for almost all solutions. Because you're using Power BI and the Power BI portal, there's no concept of an Azure portal. So people using it won't even realize they're using Azure. They just look like it's using Power BI and additional functionality on there. So no Azure portal, no subscriptions, no having to create storage. It's automatically done for you. So it makes it real easy to get started and to build solutions. There's a big separation between the person who buys or pays the bill and the person who is building stuff. If you think of Synapse, what happens there is there'll be IT engineers who will be given permission to go and use Synapse and charge the compute. So the same person who's building stuff is also given the permission and the privilege to go and buy stuff with it. That within Fabric is much different. You have one person who's going to go and kind of say everybody within our tenant or our company can go and build stuff. They just flip that switch. So you don't have to get special permission to build stuff like you do in Synapse. You're just given permission. You add these, you see the additional functionality within Power BI, and then people can go and build it. Again, the trade-offs comes into play, and you have to be careful. If you flip this switch, everybody in your company can now have access to go and build stuff. They can create lake houses, warehouses, data factory, machine learning. You got to be careful because you can get a really large bill because everybody's going and doing their own stuff. Now you can limit who can use Fabric, but it's all or nothing. You can't say only certain people can do certain things, at least not yet. So I always give people, it's a warning. Once you give somebody access to that, you want to monitor what they're doing so they're not just going and building stuff and charging a bunch of costs and not having anything come out of that. Fabric is also a big change in that it's not just for departmental use, meaning I could be a person that is going to build a small application, or somebody in IT is going to build an enterprise application. They're all going to use Fabric. The way it is before Fabric came along was IT people would use Synapse, and then departmental people, individuals would use Power BI to build solutions. So if somebody built a small solution, you want to make enterprise, they'd have to move everything to Synapse. Then you have two sets of technologies you're trying to learn. Fabric allows everybody to do everything in it. So there's one set of tools, and it's easy then to move projects you build from a small departmental use to enterprise use, because it's all within Fabric on that. So whether you're building a one-person solution or a huge data warehouse, are all going to be using Fabric. And the Fabric is broken out into personas, and the personas look like this. So the idea is, if I come in here, I want to limit the confusion. If I'm just a data citizen, I'm just going to build reports. I don't want to see all this other stuff. So you can use personas when you start out, and the idea is the screens that are displayed are limiting what you can see. You still have access to everything else, but it's customized to make it easier depending on your persona. It doesn't do as much as I'd like. It's just basically a couple screens that get customized. Down the road, there'll be more customizations in there, but it's a good starting point to minimize the confusion if you now have one tool that everybody's going to be using. All right, so I'll pause there if anybody has questions as I take a sip of water. Just come off mute as if you have any questions. If not, I'll just keep on going.
A question on the Delta Lake. So is it based on the open source technology?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. Databricks a few years ago came out with Delta Lake, and they open sourced it. At first they didn't open source everything, but now they've open sourced all of it. So the great thing about that is, if you build something in Fabric, it stores in the Delta Lake. Because it's open source, you can then use that data with any other product outside of Fabric. So Databricks being one of them. You can build stuff in Fabric that Databricks can use, and vice versa. And so you're not locked into Fabric. If you go in there and you build something, and any other product you want to use outside of it that supports Delta Lake can use it. So that's why I think Microsoft made a great decision on standardizing on open source, and you're not having some dedicated or specific technology that's being used that means you can only use Fabric.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Yeah. A little bit about workspaces and capacities, and then I'll jump into a demo. So it's universal compute. As I mentioned, it's a big bucket, and there's a true separation of compute and storage. So they're not tied together. It's one bucket of compute that everything uses, and one storage called OneLake that everything uses. And then the way it'll break out is, if you have a tenant in your company, you could have, on the example on the left, you have one tenant. Sometimes customers have multiple tenants, but usually they have one. So you'll take, within this tenant, you will break it out into capacities. The idea being, instead of having one capacity everybody uses, you could say, well, I'm going to have a marketing capacity, and the marketing people need to have a very high level of capacity on there. So I'll dedicate that capacity to them, and then I will assign workspaces to that capacity, and then people to those workspaces. So I can put these people in say the product in a workspace, tie that workspace to a capacity that has a lot of compute that they can use. On the other hand, you may have finance people, and they don't need much capacity. So I will give them a capacity that's limited, and they're going to use that. So this opens up a lot of possibilities in there. You can have lots of capacities. You can use this for security reasons. You can use it for cost management reasons. You could avoid people colliding with other people and taking all the capacity on there. So you have to think through how you want to design this. But what you'll do is start out by going and creating one or many capacities and choosing the tier that is being used. And you can see here, you could define the region that it's in. So I can have multiple capacities across the country or the world. And then I would assign workspaces to them. So I create all my capacities, they'd be listed here. Then I start creating workspaces. And then each workspace in the bottom right, you tie it to a capacity, which is going to be part of the US, or as I mentioned before here on the left, on the region on here. So the regions across the whole world, that's the way Azure works on there. You always pick a region for everything on here. So you could do things like, well, okay, I'm going to have a region in the US East and the US West, and assign people to a workspace who are in the US East, so they're closer to that capacity and they're all sharing data that's close to them, as opposed to maybe being across the country, across the world, and then you have some delay in accessing that data. So a lot of things to think through, but this gives you a lot of great flexibility. To turn on Fabric is you simply go into the admin portal under tenant settings and you flip this switch on. And then everybody gets access to all these additional features in Fabric. You could limit it to certain groups. It's an all or nothing thing. They'll have access to all of Fabric features or not, but you can limit them at the tenant level. You can also limit them at the capacity level. So you can say certain people can have access to Fabric, and I want to override what is at the tenant level. So it's another way of customizing things. So it's pretty easy to get started and get set up. And then jumping to the demos, what you'll see once I flip that switch on, what you'll see here is, well, I'll go, and this is what you typically see when you're using Power BI. The only way you can tell that you're actually using Fabric is in the bottom left, you have this little icon here. If it's not on the switch, you won't see that. If it's on, you see it. If I click it and go to Microsoft Fabric, you're going to, we'll call it the home page, where it has all those personas. And then you can start out and saying, okay, I'm a data engineer person. When I click on this, what it does is Microsoft says, I think a data engineer is going to want to use these features here most often. So that screen is customized depending on what you choose. So if I want to go in here and choose Data Factory, you get different icons on here. And that's it. That's the only customization that's done. Eventually there's going to be more, but for now it's just the home page. And you're not limited to what you see here. I can hit create, and then this lists everything I can do. So everybody, as long as you're in that group that can use Fabric, will see all of this. If you're not in Fabric, you're just going to be able to see this stuff. Within Fabric, you get all this other stuff: real-time analytics, data warehouse, data science, data factory, data engineered, a new product called Data Activator. And this is how you get started. So you can come in here and you can be an end user and say, as an example, I have data, it's sitting on my computer, I want to analyze this data. I don't want to have to go to IT. How easy can Fabric be for me to start transforming this data and creating a report? So that's what I'll show you. You come here and you say, okay, I have this data, I want to create a Lakehouse, and I want to put all this data in this Lakehouse in here. So in my example, I'm just gonna, it just takes a couple seconds to create this, but I'm going to show you what I've previously created. And this is the sales Lakehouse on here. So what will happen is once you create your data lake, and you will then jump to the screen that is going to give you the ability to upload this data. Come on, don't fail me now, demo. And you can see at the bottom, it decides to wait for me. I do have backup slides if this doesn't work. Oh, here we go. So it's loading the Lakehouse. Usually this takes just a couple seconds when you're first in it. So if you look here on the upper right, we're in what's called Lakehouse mode. And what this does is it allows you to upload files here and start getting value out of them. So if I go to the file section, you'll see I have an upload files here. So I can just start selecting files on my desktop to upload. There's many other ways to get data in here. I could use Data Factory and land data in here. There's even an extender here called OneLake. So if I download this little exe and run it, it looks like you get what you get when you have OneDrive on here. So I could start dragging files through my Windows Explorer here and put data in here. That's another way. But in this case, imagine I went and uploaded a file. And if I look at previous uploaded files, you'll see, as an example, I have a Canadian one. It's a CSV file. Once you upload the file, you're in what's called this unmanaged section, meaning I can upload video files, media files on here, but you're generally going to upload something that's a table. and it will automatically recognize it's a table. This currently only works for Parquet. Eventually it'll work for CSV and JSON. So in the meantime, you can right click this and say load to tables. And what this does is it'll copy this Canada file over into where you can see where I did it previously. If I click on that, it shows me what's in the file. So what it does is when I upload it, it says, oh, this is a CSV file. It looks inside of it, says this is actually a table. I'm going to copy it over to the tables section. Underneath the covers, this stores in a Delta format. If I click on here and I do view files, you'll see it's in Delta format. It could have one or multiple Parquet files, which is what Delta uses behind the scenes, and then it has a log file where it keeps track of everything that's been done to the file. We hide that from the end user because they don't really need to know that, but that's showing you what goes on behind the scenes. So as an end user, I upload the file, it shows me what's in there, and you can say, okay, now I want to do stuff with this file. I want to maybe query it and transform it. So if I go back up to the top right here, and I click on this, I have what's called SQL endpoint mode. And what this does is it adds additional functionality on top of that CSV file in order to gain insights to that or do some transformations. So here I'm back at that Canada file. Now I could say I want to create a query on this. So if I'm a T-SQL person, I can then have a interface of T-SQL on top of this, and I can start putting where clauses and aggregations and do all kinds of stuff on here. And then once I get it to where I like it, I can either say, well, let me download this Excel file. Everybody loves Excel. Or I can just visualize results, meaning if I click this, I can have a nice, long, sophisticated SQL statement. It's going to take the results of this statement, and it's going to create a Power BI data set. And then from that data set, which behind the scenes is using that T-SQL I created, it's going to allow me to create a report. And I can now go and build this report. So this is for people who like to do stuff in T-SQL. Now, a lot of people like to use Power Query. So for those customers, those end users, they can click on New Visual Query, which behind the scenes is using Power Query. So if I drag that Canada file on here, now I have that visual Power Query interface with all the functionality of Power Query. So if you're using Data Factory, they have Power Query in there. It's called a lot of different naming conventions, which I'll get into in there, but it's Power Query behind the scenes. And in Power BI, if you use data flows, that's using Power Query. So the interface will look similar to those who've used those features before. So again, I can go and transform all the data and then use it, download the Excel or visualize it. So that's two different ways you can choose to go and start transforming this data. You're not limited to Fabric. There's endpoints to all this. So I can go into, say, SSMS or Data Studio and point to this data lakehouse and then use that tool, or any tool that is able to go to SQL Server. It can use this. I also can model with this. So imagine I have a number of files that are tables and I upload them. Maybe one of them is called, it's a fact table and other dimension tables. I can upload all those. They get converted to tables, and then I can do all the transformations I want to it and land them back into tables. And then I can go into the model view and create the relationships between all of these tables. So if I click on this, I'm able to create that relationships. This was only previously available in Microsoft in Power BI Desktop. That feature has been brought into here, so you don't have to use Power BI Desktop. It doesn't yet have everything Power BI Desktop does, but it has, I would say, 80% of desktop. So the idea is an end user can do everything within Fabric. So this is one use case where very quickly an end user can just upload files, transform them, create a Power BI model, create a Power BI data set, and then start creating reports and dashboards off of that. So this is the ease of use that makes this a lot easier to use than Synapse, and also makes it easy for any person that has any kind of technical skills or the ability to kind of learn things can go and start using Synapse. And then they can create this solution, and eventually somebody in IT may say, this is a great solution, I want to make it enterprise wide, so I'm going to take over the project, but I don't have to do anything. I'm just going to use what you've created and build off of that to create an enterprise vision, because we're all using the same tool. And then there's things you can save queries on here and share queries. I won't go into all that. But the idea is you're creating this relational serving layer on top of all of these tables that could then be used by anybody else who's using Fabric. So I'll pause there for questions.
James, I think there's a question in the chat.
Okay. Let me pull up the chat. Oh, here it is. Can Fabric be auto provision? Is that the one you're talking about?
Yes, that's right.
Via Terraform or Ansible. So those are technologies that you can say scripts that allow you to go and build out this environment. Not yet. There is an API we'll call it the Fabric API that eventually will be available, so you can use things like Terraform to build this out if you don't want to use this environment. So that's the answer to that. Not yet. So I failed to mention that Fabric is in public preview, and it has been since I think May, so like 5 months. So you can expect it to GA. I can't tell you when, but I would say look at the calendar for big Microsoft events that are coming up, and that's typically when things go GA. So you can expect it fairly soon to be GA'd. And one thing they're going to do with Fabric that they haven't done with most other products, including Synapse, is they're going to have public roadmaps. So like you can do with Power BI, you can go out and they've been very good with Power BI to show you everything they're working on and when it's going to come out. They're going to do that with Fabric, since it really is a Power BI product now. And you'll be able to see the roadmap and timelines of features that are not yet in the product, when they will be made available in public preview and when they will be GA. So you can expect that roadmap to be out any day now. I don't know for sure when. It's been kind of delayed, but that is a way to see if the roadmap of Fabric aligns with what you want to build in your company and decide if you want to use Fabric or not. Chris, thanks for your question. Would I use this with structured data only, or can I upload a large collection of JSON data? So it can be used with structured or semi-structured data. So you could use JSON. So if I go back to this Lakehouse, if you look under uploaded files, there's a JSON one here. Now, right now, it doesn't allow you yet to right-click this and say, I want to make a table, but that's coming. So the idea is, even if you upload JSON files, it could be very easy to make that into a table and to give it some structure and then get value out of it. So the answer is yes, soon, hopefully, fingers crossed. All right, so let's see. Both data warehouse and Lakehouse data stored on Delta Format. Is there any difference in the format? No, underneath the covers are all the same. Now, there are little specifics that get stored depending on whether you're using Lakehouse or warehouse, and I'll talk to that in the upcoming in there. But any product that understands Delta Lake can read that data no matter what product behind the scenes stored it, whether it's a Lakehouse, a warehouse, or some real-time product that you see here, like Data Activator. It all stores in Delta Lake, so it's all available for other products to use. Hans asked, we just finished the Synapse implementation. Won't be a good definite case to move to Fabric? I would say soon, when it goes GA. And I have some slides at the end. I don't have time to get to them, but I'll make this deck available to everybody, where it goes into more detail of how you can move over from Synapse. Eventually there'll be migration tools. They're not there yet. That'll make it real easy to move to Synapse, but I say keep doing what you're doing in Synapse. If you're just getting it started in Synapse, there are a few things that you want to do to make the transition easier, like don't use dedicated pools. Put everything in a Lakehouse and use serverless on that, because dedicated pools don't exist in here. Now, there are workarounds. There'll be a way to, what they call, mount a dedicated pool so you can continue using it in there. But there are a number of things you can do to make that transition easier. But eventually, the Fabric will have everything Synapse has, but it's not there yet. And maybe it's going to be there in a year or longer. I don't know. But until that point comes, then there'll be some use cases where you use Synapse. But most customers, once this GAs, I think you probably maybe 7% will use Fabric because it'll have everything they need. Another question is that allow real-time connectivity with source files. So if data changes in the files, the Lakehouse will also be updated. This gets into how you're copying the data. So if I have source files in there, I'm going to copy the data from those source files into the OneLake, and then I'm going to use that data. If you know the medallion architecture and different layers, generally you have a raw layer. You take that source data, you convert it into a silver layer or a clean layer, and then you may go and take that data into a gold layer or a presentation layer where the data has been joined and aggregated and whatnot in there. So I wouldn't say there is no. You wouldn't really want to have real-time connectivity to source files, because you need to do transformations and merge it with other data. Now you could do that. You could have it linked directly to a source. I just would advise against it in most cases in there. That's probably a side conversation we can have depending on your use case to see if that would be relevant on there. That gets into the whole updating data from a source file. What's the best way to update it? A flush and fill, incremental updates in there. Do I have timestamps to do all that? That gets into a whole other conversation about the best way to keep the data lake updated. All right, another one. Can OneLake subscribe to remote feed and import data on change published? There's no subscription, if that's what you're getting at. Well, that's probably a good segue into showing some ideas that what you can do with OneLake. This is reiterating that you store everything in Delta Parquet. There are workspaces, and within those workspaces, you can have folders depending on how you set them up and which products you're using. So all that data is all going to be in OneLake. And a feature in OneLake that's unique is that you can do shortcuts. So I can have OneLake, as I showed in that previous example, and upload data there, and it's all local. However, I can also create shortcuts that point to data that could be in other data lakes around the country or the world. I can also point to Amazon S3, eventually Google, and eventually SQL database, and a bunch of other things on there. So going back to, let me pull up another example here, what a shortcut would look like. Going to this demo Lakehouse. What you'll see here is I uploaded a bunch of files like before, but I also created these shortcuts indicated by this little paperclip looking thing. And the way to do that is I just say shortcut, and it launches this wizard and says, okay, what do you want to shortcut to? Other fabrics or something in the data lake or Amazon 3. And once I do that, it appears here. And if I click on this, it's pulling up this data, which to the end user appears like it's all locally, but actually it's pointing to files that could be anywhere. So the whole idea is making it really easy to consolidate in one spot all this data without having to physically copy it to one location. So you can think of it as like a lightweight virtualization layer on here. Eventually this is going to be expanded out to much more connections that I mentioned here. So a lot of work is going to be put into creating this environment that becomes sort of the center of the universe in here, and data will be cached if it's not in here. So if I have data, say in Amazon, and I come here and create a shortcut to it, if somebody goes and says, I want to use this data in Amazon, instead of previously you'd have to copy all that data over and then keep it updated. Here, it's just going to copy over the data that's used, and it's automatically going to keep it updated. So each time somebody else comes in there, it says, oh, it's the same data. I'm going to use what's in the cache, but first let me see if it's been changed. And if so, I'll re-import that data. If not, I'll just use what's in the cache in there. So really cool and sophisticated feature. And what this allows is a great synergy with Databricks on here. So I can go out and within Databricks, and I can create a medallion architecture of these 3 layers in here. And if I want to use those in OneLake, I don't have to copy into OneLake. I just create the shortcut right to this data lake. And then whenever it's updated in Databricks, I'm seeing it immediately in OneLake. And then vice versa. I could, within Fabric, create a medallion architecture, and then within Databricks, you essentially create a shortcut to that. So Databricks would see whatever gets updated in there. So you're not having 2 sets of copies in there, and so it's always updated on that. So that's because of Delta Lake. They understand the file format, and then you can share it among this. So if I do something in Fabric, I can use that data outside of Fabric. All right. Can we trigger an import process into a pre-existing folder in a workspace? So that gets into Data Factory. There's ways to do that to import the data. If you're familiar with Data Factory and how you can monitor folders and automatically trigger a copy, all that stuff exists within Fabric because it's using the same code that you find in Data Factory. And so any other questions? Data physically copied using the shortcut. It is physically copied behind the scenes into cache. You're not aware of how that works. You don't really care or want to know how that works. It just works, and it's very fast. And I've used it on very large amounts of data, and it works really well. And it is similar to an external table concept in there, but just a lot easier to use. So good questions in there, and that was a good segue. So let me talk a little bit about, well, I talked about Lakehouse in here, so this is just reiterating what I went over. Like I said, I'll make this deck available. And so what you can have then is I can have a file in a Lakehouse, and then I can use that among multiple capacities and multiple workspaces. This is something you couldn't do in Synapse. So this allows me to have a lot of high concurrency of all these people over here could be accessing the same file on there. They can all have their own unique compute, and by giving them capacities on there. So this allows for a great ability to share data among dozens or hundreds or thousands of people. Now we also have a warehouse on here, and this is not easy to explain, but we still have the concept of a warehouse, even though underneath the covers it's storing it in Delta Lake. There is a Lakehouse and there is a warehouse. And when this first came out, I said, well, why don't they just have one? Why have 2? And here's the reason why is I explained it here, is Delta Lake's got some shortcomings to it. For example, it doesn't support multiple table transactions. So you may have heard Delta Lake supports ACID transactions, but that only works on one table. So if I'm updating a table and if something blows up, it could roll back and that table could be consistent. But that only works on one table. I can't have a begin transaction, update a bunch of tables, and an end transaction and roll back if needed on multiple tables. That Delta Lake just doesn't support that. So if you have that use case, that is where you want to create a warehouse, as talked about here. Other things is SQL support is limited on what you can do in a Lakehouse. You can't use T-SQL and write to a Lakehouse. There's also some read functionality that doesn't exist because Delta Lake just doesn't support all this T-SQL stuff in there. So if I needed to use all the T-SQL, which isn't there yet, eventually it will be, but if I needed a lot of T-SQL support because my end users use T-SQL, then you might want to look toward using a data warehouse. A couple more things is performance problems exist if you're doing a lot of individual updates, deletes, and inserts. So if your solution is doing that, a data warehouse will give you better performance. And then lastly, there's no idea of schemas within a lakehouse. So if maybe you're migrating something with a lot of schemas, warehouse would be the way to go. Now, eventually, hopefully, Delta Lake addresses all those shortcomings and makes them all available, and then we don't have to have a lakehouse and a warehouse. But for now, you're going to have both, and probably in the foreseeable future, I don't see that changing. So the way to think about this is the persona of the person who's going to be writing data. If they are a Spark person, they like using Spark notebooks, they like the Spark engine, meaning they like doing things in Python, R, Scala, Spark SQL. They are going to want to create a lakehouse because only Spark engine can write to a lakehouse. I should caveat with that saying you could still use pipelines and Data Factory. I can still upload stuff, but if I'm doing any kind of coding in a lakehouse and writing to it, I'd have to use a Spark engine. On the other side of it, if I'm a T-SQL person, I love stored procedures, I want to use other products that support T-SQL, I want to use SQL engine, I want the full T-SQL support, I'm going to want to create a warehouse. And yeah, I can use Data Factory in that too. But a warehouse is for those people who want to use a SQL engine to write the data. So what this looks like is I can have a mixture. I can have people writing Spark and creating tables, data lakehouse tables. I can also have people using T-SQL and writing data into a warehouse. I could then use T-SQL to read from both, or I can use Spark to read from both. So while I can only limit it on what I can write, either SQL or Spark can read from it. So what this could look like in a medallion architecture is I can say, well, in my use case in my company, the developers are going to want to use Spark to take data from source systems into the bronze layer or the raw layer. So I'm going to create a lakehouse and I'm going to use Spark to copy that data over into the lakehouse. I can then say, well, my company, the developers love Spark to transform data. So I'm going to create, for the silver layer, I'm going to create a lakehouse and I'm going to use Spark notebooks to transform all that data and land them in there. However, I could say the end users who will be using that gold layer where it's presentation ready, they love T-SQL. So what I'm going to do is take the data in the silver lakehouse. I'm going to use T-SQL to write that data into a warehouse, and then everybody over here can read and write the data in the warehouse in the gold layer because it's a warehouse, and that's what T-SQL supports. Now there could be any number of variations. All this could be a lakehouse, all this could be a warehouse. I have some customers who in the gold layer will have a combination warehouse and lakehouse. Some people are Spark people and they want that presentation layer in a lakehouse, others T-SQL in a warehouse in there. So you have to think through how you want to do this. The beauty of this though is compared to Synapse, you would have to copy this data to a relational storage, which has got its own dedicated pool, and you got a whole different environment for dealing with data that you want to use T-SQL for. Here, it's very easy to move between the two. They're all still in Delta format. I can quickly copy one from the other. I'm using the same tools. And so if I go and I look at a warehouse that I've created on here, I could, let me pull up this one called this demo lakehouse. Where is it? Demo warehouse. Demo lakehouse. Oops, my bad. That's not what I wanted. It's, where did it go? Oh, here it is, the warehouse sample. Sorry. So this was a warehouse I created. on that. Again, it just popped up a box. I typed in the warehouse sample name, and the interface looks just like the Lakehouse. The only difference is there's nothing in the top right to switch from Lakehouse, because in the warehouse, there's no concept of files and folders. Everything is in tables on there. So that's why you don't see that piece. So you're going to use this just like you would with the Lakehouse on there. So this is why it makes it easy. I can write T-SQL, and that can go again, if I'm reading it, I can go against data that's sitting in the Lakehouse, or I can switch it to a warehouse or vice versa on there. So that's why the two are very close. It's just unfortunately the right capability that makes you have to have one or the other for your right situation. All right, so let me go a little bit about Data Factory in here. We got about 10 minutes to go. To keep those questions coming, I'll pause in a minute for other questions in there. This is to clear up the confusion, as I was really confused because Microsoft loves renaming things and changing different names. So if we think of Data Factory on here, you have three ways of dealing with data in Data Factory. You have pipelines, which have all these activities. One of them could be copy data from point A to point B. You're not doing any transformations, so you use the pipelines for that. Pipelines will also call data flows and Power Query, which I show next on there. So that's an orchestration layer. The two ways you can transform data in Data Factory is what's called data flows, with that space in the name between them. They used to be called mapping data flows, sometimes still are. This allows you to just transform data. So a lot of times you'll copy data from a source into raw, and then you'll use data flows to take that data from raw, transform it, land it into the middle layer, that silver layer on that. This is what first came out with Data Factory. Then a year or two later, Microsoft came out with another way to transform data, and that was called Power Query, also called wrangling data flows. So this is using Power Query behind the scenes that I demoed on here. So this was a newer and arguably better and easier way of transforming data. All three are available in Data Factory. If you're looking at Synapse, which has Data Factory built in, they have pipelines in here. It's called the same thing. They also have data flows with the space in between the words on that. Synapse does not have Power Query in there. So it's a limitation of Synapse. Power Query also exists in Power BI under called data flows, no space in between there. So it's using Power Query underneath the covers. Why they didn't call Power Query, I don't know, but just to confuse my life and make it more difficult. So that's what we have now. Now jumping into Fabric. Fabric has pipelines, they call it data pipelines. Mapping data flows do not exist within Fabric. They went with Power Query because the idea is, why have two options? Power Query is again arguably the easier way, so we're just going to go with Power Query. But let's not leave well enough alone. Instead of calling it Power Query, let's call it something different, and that's Data Flow Gen 2. What's in Power BI now, you can think of Data Flow Gen 1. The reason they call it Gen 2 is because they're adding additional performance features and scalability on top of it that you saw with data flows is now added into Power Query. So Power Query is kind of best of both worlds, and they decided to call it Data Flow Gen 2. And so this is what I showed in the demo. This is what you would use to transform data. Now, if you've built stuff in Synapse, you can, and use mapping data flows, you can pull it in and copy that and continue using it in there. But if you're just starting out building in something in Synapse and you're going to use Fabric later and migrate later, don't use data flows, mapping data flows in there. Instead, use wrangling data flows, which doesn't exist in Synapse, which means use Data Factory outside of Synapse, use wrangling data flows, and then it'll make it easy to migrate over into Fabric down the road. And so I have some slides in here that talk about the difference between those three, as well as using things in Spark. But that is something I wanted to cover. And then questions, can we say Fabric is third generation from similar Databricks and Snowflake features? Ooh, can of worms. So Snowflake is the main reason why Fabric was built, was to directly compete against Snowflake, to catch and surpass Snowflake in ease of use of building solutions, which I think they've done. And they've also standed on Delta-like open format, which Snowflake has its own proprietary storage. So if you do something in Synapse or in Snowflake, you have to copy out of Snowflake into a data lake and then use it. Well, as I showed before, you don't have to worry about that in Fabric. You can share the data without having to copy it. So it is arguably better than Snowflake when it GAs, and has better integration with all our other products, because Snowflake is just a database engine. It's very good, but Snowflake relies on other customers' products to integrate for reporting and ETL and cataloging and all that stuff. With Fabric, all that is built in, so it's in my view, a lot easier integration with everything. And then as compared with Databricks, that's a whole other can of worms. Databricks is a great partner. It works well with Databricks, as we've shown. Yeah, you can argue that there are things you can do in Fabric that means you don't have to use Databricks. A lot of it comes down to, I ask customers, are you using Databricks now? Yeah, we'll continue using Databricks. Use Fabric alongside of it. If you're not using Databricks, then use Fabric until you can't. Even if you need to get to Spark, it's got it built in. So you probably do almost everything you need to without having to go to Databricks if you're not there already. But it depends a lot on the use case. So good question. The last thing I wanted to point out was in Power BI, you have two ways of accessing data: direct query and import mode. Direct query means if I run a report in Power BI, it pushes the query down to the source system, runs that query, and then pulls back the results. So this is great in that it's real time. Whenever you run a report, it's going to give you the latest data, but it can be slow because it's got to push down the query and return on the results. So some customers use that. Most of them use import, which takes the data from the source system, imports it into Power BI in the tabular mode underneath the covers, and that is used for reports. So you get millisecond response time because it's in memory, with the trade-off that the data is only as late as new as the last time the import was run. So you have to do refreshes, maybe once a day, maybe once an hour. So you don't have that real-time capability in there. They've solved this decision point by saying you don't have to worry about it anymore. There's a thing called Direct Lake, which I call it the on-demand import model, because underneath the covers, Delta Lake is very similar to that tabular model in memory. Whenever you now run a report on a file that's sitting in one lake, it'll on the fly import that, and it imports it very quickly because it's already in the format it needs, and it only imports what's needed. So that means there's no more scheduled imports and no more having to import all the data, because the import, you would have to copy all the data, whether it's going to be used or not. You want to copy it all in there in case it's being used. This, it'll just import what's needed, and it will check each time you run it if data has been updated, and so it'll re-import it again. So directly, it's a really cool thing. The only trade-off I would say is if you have a really large amount of data, like many terabytes, you may see some performance issues where it'll actually switch to direct query mode, and there's this whole guide goes through this. But I would say 90% of your cases, Direct Lake is going to work really well for you. And then I'll end it with, should I use Fabric now? I would say yes for prototype and piloting. If you won't be in production for a few months, so you can start building something now, and by the time you finish, Fabric will be GA'd. And if you're okay in public preview with, you can have bugs and a few features are missing, some performance issues can come along. I would say avoid it if you're gonna have hundreds of terabytes, if you don't want to GAs until there's more testing done on petabytes of data. And then right now, there's not part of that is a thing called One Security. So it's hard to limit access to data within Fabric by individuals. And I think that was one of the questions I had. So until that One Security piece is in there, I wouldn't use Fabric for if you have a lot of PII, if you have PII data. I mentioned if you're building a Synapse as a way to make transactions smooth. I talked about don't create dedicated pools. I think I mentioned all this stuff in here. And then finally, there's individual products that you can look through this list to make your migration easier. And so I just point out some learnings that I've had. And that's it. So top reason to use Fabric as takeaways in there. I went over most of this stuff. So it's an awesome product, and we're finding tremendous amount of interest in it. A lot of customers are starting to build production systems in there. And I think in short order, a year or two, it's just going to be extremely popular and used by, again, not just IT, but all these citizen developers who've always wanted to build their own solutions, but it was too complicated, or they had to go and ask IT to do it. Now they can go and build solutions on their own. All right. Other questions? I'll see a couple. How directly wants to compete against Kafka. Kafka is a real-time streaming. We do have a Kafka competitor in there, and I didn't talk about real-time analytics. That, as I mentioned, that's too much to cover, but it does a great job at real-time streaming. You can still use Kafka and land in OneLake if that's what your skill set is, but if not, then I would look at the real-time streaming capability within Fabric. How to implement the data virtualization fabrics. That again is through the shortcuts. It's not a full-blown data virtualization like you see in some other products out there, but it's a lightweight version that can solve most of your needs just by creating that shortcut, which is really easy to use. All right. Anything else? I almost lost my voice. Oh, long day.
Oh, thank you, James. Yeah, it's been a great presentation. I learned a lot. I will reach out to you to get the slides, and we'll post it on the meetup group.
Yeah, so any follow-up questions, you want the slides, I'll send them to you and you can post it. But just send it out to that email right there, and I'm happy to help answer anything else.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you, James. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. I appreciate your time.
Good night and thanks.
Night.